Well, welcome to this episode of the Terms of Engagement. It's a series of interviews in which we discussed various issues that define and determine the idea of India, Indian identities, and how various constituent groups in this country relate to one another and form one country or one nation. Niraja Gopal Jayal is a political scientist who works at the intersection of political theory and Indian politics. Her scholarly work has been in four main areas: democracy, representation, citizenship, and governance. Thank you, Professor Jayal, for joining with us on this special episode of Terms of Engagement, in which discuss contemporary political issues with a background and a context of theoretical perspective. So,
Thank you.
You've the idea of citizenship is very central to everything that we discuss these days, because there are contested ideas of who actually belongs to India, who is actually eligible to be proper citizen to this country. So the idea of citizenship is relevant and makes sense only when there are non-citizens who are not eligible to be there. So can you describe, or can you tell us, how do we identify, or generally how do we approach the idea of who is citizen and who is not?
Usually, we take it for granted that everyone who lives in a political community, in a polity, is a fellow citizen. Usually, we don't question that in most contexts. But you're right, the question of non-citizens has become a pressing issue in India as well as in several other countries. In other countries, because of immigration and the tensions that are sometimes caused, social, economic, and other tensions that sometimes arise as a consequence of immigration. In our country, it's less because of immigration, it's actually the contemporary debate on legal citizenship in our context is substantially about our own people. It's sometimes taking the form of othering our own citizens. These are not necessarily people who have come in from outside. We have had a history of immigration even before probably the term was invented in this country for a very long time historically. And people have settled, assimilated, and become part of the soil. Today, for political reasons, this has become a contested site. Legal citizenship has become a contested site, and along with the othering of one's own people, there is also the attempt to establish, to prove that certain sections of our population who claim to be citizens are not actually citizens. And what we're doing in that process sometimes is actually rendering bona fide citizens stateless. So, I mean, I presume that you're referring to the issue in Eastern India. You're referring to the question of, Assam politics since the 1980s. And, it is a fact that there has been immigration in that state over a long period of time from the early 20th century. Bengali labor brought into Assam by the British and so on. We know that. We also know that there's been immigration from what is Bangladesh now at the time of its creation, before but also after. We're aware of that. But the politicization of that issue has led to actually making people who are citizens historically, but they are poorly documented or undocumented for a variety of reasons. We are in general a poorly documented society, and the poor are worse documented than anyone else. But so we have had a history now of undocumented nationals being put under the cloud of not being citizens, with documented non-nationals who acquire documents through various kinds of networks, documented non-nationals actually becoming bona fide citizens. So it's a very peculiar situation.
We will actually go into some details about what you just mentioned. But before we get there, so a country or a nation state, or I don't know what the proper term to be used, it requires a territory and the people who live in that territory. So the territory is bounded, it has borders.
Yes.
And then the people, by being citizens, it's a legal status, and there are various other dimensions which we will get into. But you need people and territory. India is a unique case where what constitutes Indian territory was a historical accident because of various reasons and legacy of colonialism. A border was drawn, country, subcontinent was divided, and there was India with a border. So you talk about how Indian Constituent Assembly discussed this idea of who will be citizens, and they take an ad hoc arrangement, ad hoc decision, saying that okay, for the time being, let us freeze this eligibility criteria, and once you have a proper parliament and other things, there could be more detailed discussion, and then the Citizenship Act comes into place. Can you recall that process?
Yeah. Certainly. So the Constituent Assembly, as you rightly point out, was already, of course, had begun its deliberations at the time that partition happened, and a date was determined before which the exchange of populations could take place. It was March 1947. However, movement of populations, exchange of populations continued to take place for a considerably longer time, and that process went on. The Constituent Assembly was engaged with the question of citizenship mostly and mainly in order to settle the question of people who were coming in as refugees from what was now Pakistan, and as well as, and these were mostly Hindus and Sikhs, as well as the question of Muslim people who were living in the territory of India and had fled to Pakistan in the course of the violence that accompanied the partition, right? And many of these people wanted to come back to reclaim their lives, their livelihoods, their properties in many cases. Now, this process had to be facilitated somehow as well, and it was done by the system of resettlement permits, which would be given by the Indian High Commission in Pakistan, which was receiving, by the way, something like 1,000 applications for resettlement permits per day. Mm-hmm. Now, the Constituent Assembly was debated and hotly debated in a way that Dr. Ambedkar himself described. He said that these articles were actually a headache for the Constituent Assembly. They debated very, very vociferously the question of what the basis of Indian citizenship should be, the legal basis. And the legal basis, they determined after a very fractious debate, it should be jus soli, the basic principle of citizenship by birth on the soil of a country. That is to say, if I am born on the soil of a country, regardless of who my parents are, regardless of the nationality, ethnicity, anything of my parents, I am entitled to be a citizen by birth. That's the principle of jus soli. That principle was defended most eloquently in the Constituent Assembly by many members. The other principle, jus sanguinis, which is citizenship which comes to you through inheritance, that is to say through blood, ethnicity, race, descent. Basically, it's citizenship by descent is called jus sanguinis. There were proponents of jus sanguinis, and the proponents of jus sanguinis were basically making the argument that you're hearing from, the ruling party today, which is that that citizenship should be by descent, and that would then confine it, to certain communities.
So that will essentially mean that some people who are living in this territory may have suspect citizenship, and some people who may not be living in this territory, like the Indian Americans, may actually belong to the nation. By extension?
That's right. By the criteria of jus sanguinis, yes. I mean, the Singhvi Committee report that the Vajpayee government had set up, this LM Singhvi Committee, which actually talked about the Indian diaspora in precisely these terms, that they were connected. But you see, there was also another issue that was going on before, while the Constituent Assembly was deliberating, which is that there were claims made by Indians, the Indian diaspora in East Africa, in what was then Malaya, in what was then Ceylon. And from these places, petitions were coming to the Constituent Assembly asking for citizenship. Now, Nehru had made some grand speech in Singapore in the 40s, I don't remember the date, in which he had said, you are all sort of welcome and you are all citizens, you will all be citizens of India and so on. But when it came to the crunch, the Constituent Assembly decided that this was not to be the case, and only the people living, only the Indians living within the territory of India would actually be entitled to citizenship, with the caveat that those who had moved to Pakistan, fled under conditions of violence and insecurity, physical insecurity, could come back if they had belonged here, lived here, and so on. So that was the principle that the Constituent Assembly was settling, which was the principle of deciding who can be a citizen now and for the next so many years, given the situation we were in. I mean, the fluidity of the situation was also seen in the question of the so-called restoration and recovery of abducted women.
Right. So, I will interrupt you there. So, the fluidity of the situation, so then the Constituent Assembly was debating, they were actually hoping, their decisions were premised on the assumption or the hope that this fluidity will end and there will be a properly demarcated boundary which is enforceable. But some scholars have argued for good reasons. In fact, there is a political argument also the BJP would make is that, for example, the Citizenship Amendment Act is an unfinished agenda of partition. So, the partition has been a prolonged affair. It did not end possibly because the borders never got demarcated. You had a second partition and the movement of people across what we thought could be constituted as a territory continued. Is that a typical situation?
So, yes. But the question to be asked then is, why for the first few decades after independence, at least 30, 35 years, why was this not a problem? What happened to the shadow of the partition? What happened to the unfinished business at that time? This was not an issue, a political issue. Yes, we did see the long shadow of the partition by, which you can actually trace back to the early 20th century, right? Intercommunity violence and the politics of community mobilization, that you can take back to even the colonial period. You don't have to, of course, the partition was a specific kind of conjuncture which was extremely violent and extremely important. But however, so we do see that shadow. We do see that shadow in terms of intercommunity violence after independence. We do see that shadow in the consolidation or attempts to consolidate electoral blocks. We do see that kind of thing. One place where we see it, and if I may digress for a moment here, one place where we see that, and that is actually the legacy of, in some senses, the Constituent Assembly, which too was participating in this peculiar vocabulary around citizenship, around the concept of citizenship and the cognate concepts of migrant and refugee that came up at the time. So, if you look at the Constituent Assembly debates, you will see that there are people that the members of the Assembly are using the term migrants for the Muslims who had left and wished to come back, and they are using the term refugee for Hindus and Sikhs who were simply transferring from what had become Pakistan to India, right? So, and that has had a very long life in our polity, even today. I mean, since 2003, of course, the term illegal
was added, the prefix was added.
The prefix has been added, illegal migrant. And with the CAA 2019, all except Muslims have been, only Muslims are illegal migrants today. Everybody else has been destigmatized. And that too is a peculiar Indian invention, because in other countries, in the US for instance, they use the term undocumented aliens. In many other countries, they use the people without papers. Or refugees. Refugees are different. So, because there is an element of volition. A refugee does not, a refugee moves, the movement of the refugee is not necessarily out of volition. The movement of the migrant is usually voluntary. That's the usual, way of actually understanding these terms. But in our context, they've got coded, since the time of the Constituent Assembly, coded in terms of religious identity. So, Hindus and Sikhs are refugees, Muslims are migrants and now illegal migrants.
So that legacy continues all the way in, it echoes in the CAA as well.
Yes.
The questions about, for example, why the refugees, migrants, who, whatever you call them, from Sri Lanka are not included. They said, oh no, that is nothing to do with partition. We are only dealing with the issues that came out of partition. Do you see any merit in that argument?
Not at all. On the contrary, we don't even, they said bordering countries, neighboring countries. Afghanistan is not a neighboring country. We don't share a border with it. And I'm not clear as to what, Afghan people who are so-called refugees coming from Afghanistan, how that would be any different from Tamil refugees from Sri Lanka, right? We have had a history of accepting people, especially refugees, Tibetans, for instance. We've had a history of accepting people without even ever having signed on to any international protocol.
But that's a moral argument.
It's partly moral, it's partly also because of state capacity, the lack of state capacity to do anything about it,
right.
Even if you wanted to, which you may or may not have wanted to, but
you are just you surrender to the situation.
That's right.
No,
sorry, I think I lost your question there. What can you repeat the question? I digressed and no,
that's okay. We'll stay on this course now.
All right.
So when the Sri Lanka argument, I can turn it on its head and argue that that itself is proof that CAA does not really envisage a Hindu Rashtra in terms of membership, because that does not apply to Hindus from Sri Lanka.
But to the extent that they have been, I mean, the numbers are not so large, and to the extent that they have been assimilated, they would still be part of, they could still be plausibly part of the Hindu Rashtra. The interesting argument there actually is that Buddhist states are not seen as persecuting minorities. Buddhist neighboring states, states with whom, which are actually neighboring states, Myanmar and Sri Lanka,
yes,
they are not seen as persecuting minorities because those minorities are
part of your larger
exactly
cultural
and because they are Buddhist states.
Right, right.
So even when they perpetrate violence against minorities, they are not treated in the same way. It's Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan.
So you cite this this concept of intention. The intention becomes a determinant of how the state decides to grant you citizenship. Now you made the distinction between the refugee is actually making a choice to be a refugee. Sorry, the migrant.
Usually, in general, that's
the
general concept. Yeah.
But that becomes a legal construct, and you cite a very interesting case study of a Belgian missionary who wanted to be Indian citizen, but the state proved that no, the intentions are very clear that he actually never wanted to be here.
So because he held on to his Belgian passport.
He held on to his Belgian passport.
But he'd lived here for more than 50 years already. And they said he kept renewing his visa, and that was a sign that he did not intend to be.
Right.
So the intention argument is an argument that is present in the jurisprudence right after the partition, about especially to do with people who were either caught on the other side of the border or came, or Muslim people who went from India to Pakistan and then wanted to return. So the argument of intention was actually used in that context to start with. Did you have an intention to settle permanently in Pakistan? This was an issue that was raised in the Constituent Assembly as well, that these people have gone with the intention of settling in Pakistan. Now they want to come back. They could be fifth columnists, they could be saboteurs. All kinds of words were used by members of the Constituent Assembly. Yeah.
Which interestingly was used against Sonia Gandhi when I during one of the campaigns, I think when she entered politics, I think somebody came up with this thing. When she came to India, she lived as an Italian citizen for some years before she finally applied. So
well, it takes time to naturalize.
Yeah,
you can't naturalize in a day, even if you have the intent to.
Yeah. So the intention, when we apply intention, that actually, because it's an intangible, and that is only somebody's mind, that we are entering a very difficult territory as a legal construct.
It also doesn't speak to the reality on the ground very often. I have interviewed people, the kind of people that the CAA is actually seeks to benefit, people who migrated from on the western border from Hyderabad and Sindh in Pakistan to Rajasthan. And I've interviewed a lot of them many years earlier and long before the CAA 2019 was even thought of, even its earlier form. And many of them, especially the elderly among them then, this was, I can't put a date to it now, even the elderly among them, who were basically poor farming people, mostly Dalits and Adivasis, said that they were not aware that this thing happened, this thing called partition. They did not even know about it. They were doing whatever, they were giving whatever labor they could, selling their labor in the fields in these places that they came from eventually. But the very fact of partition completely passed them by. So how much does an ordinary citizen even know they are a citizen? What kind of a relationship with the state does an ordinary individual citizen have? These are questions that we take for granted, or the answers to these are things that we take for granted. But there are people who completely fall out of this net and have no idea of what the concept of citizens is, until, of course, when the NRC comes around and everyone is asked to prove that they are a citizen. Yeah, everyone will. The NRC, the assumption of the NRC is that everyone will be suspected to be a non-citizen until proven otherwise. So, but ordinary people, are not necessarily aware of the complexities of these concepts.
So, would you actually go to the other extreme of understanding NRC, which is to argue that whoever is residing in the territory should be deemed a citizen?
You mean as a normative statement?
As a legal right?
No, I mean, I think that the NRC is a problematic process, and I think all the problems with it are well illustrated in the one state in which it has been implemented.
If I may,
Assam,
just one. So, the state capacity that you've written about and you briefly refer to, NRC, which is actually been a legacy of both Congress and BJP government.
Correct.
It was in a way an enforcement of state capacity, saying that okay, we will indeed have the mechanism to identify who is a resident and who is a citizen. In that sense, is it a challenge to the idea of territorial citizenship, or it's a reinforcement of that?
It's a reinforcement. It's very much a reinforcement. Absolutely right. The question is, why does a state want to know? Why does a state want to have a list of all its citizens? Okay, Aadhaar provides you with a register of residence. If you want to call it a register, it's not the right word, but Aadhaar tells you who your residents are. Even there have been so many glitches. People who are dead and gone have got Aadhaar card. People who never existed have got Aadhaar cards. Some people have got more than one Aadhaar. So we know. Why does the state need the citizenry to be what we might call legible to it? Mostly, it's to deliver what the state delivers to citizens. And in this sense, I think ordinary citizens who may or may not be aware of the complexities of the concept of citizenship are aware of something else, which is their rights. And that is a very crucial element of citizenship as we discern it. Right? And that is an element of citizenship that is experienced by people, that is aspired to by people all the time, right? And it is the rights of people, especially rights to welfare, that require the state to know its citizens, to be able to identify its citizens for the purpose of, for instance, delivering welfare, right? The state also needs to know its citizens if it is providing things like affirmative action, right? Then it needs to know who is entitled to affirmative action and who is not, who falls within the definition and who falls outside the definition of it, and so forth. So there are specific reasons why states need to know who their citizens are, but there is no general requirement to know. I mean, I don't know what the answer to that question could possibly be, but it is not customary for states to want to know to want to identify and have a list of every single person who is a citizen in their territory.
But if I make the point that anybody who's born in that territory is a citizen, then it could logically flow from that.
That's right.
I hold the right to know who are born there, who live there.
Yes.
Even if it is starting from tomorrow, only those people who are being born can be citizens. So the citizenship, that itself is a right, in the sense that the rights that flow from being a citizen is what you
Yeah,
described.
but there are very few countries now that still practice unconditional jus soli. We made it conditional a while ago, and now it's closer to non-existent. But very few countries still respect the principle of birth, if it's delinked from the nationality of parents. So yes, that is the ideal principle to follow. That even the Constituent Assembly argued was the enlightened principle, the modern principle, the democratic, the progressive principle. It is the inclusive principle to follow, and that is the basis on which, when states find themselves becoming sovereign states, as we did in 1947, it is the population that you have. Though, of course, in our case, there were also the princely states, which were then integrated, if I may use that term. I know it's not a term that would appeal to everyone, to all states, but yes, till the states were integrated, those were people who were subjects of rulers in territories which were not part of British India, right? And then there were citizenship issues concerned with that as well.
So would you, would you agree with the suggestion that a civic nationalist concept and membership based on that idea will also lead us to the requirement of a list of people?
I mean, I think there are many other things that states need to do. And in the process of doing them, they can collect the data and the information that is needed for that particular purpose, whether it's to deliver healthcare or whether it's to ensure affirmative action, reservations, and so on. But I don't think that there is a general requirement. I don't understand the need for a general or the need for a state any state to have a complete list of people that are its citizens, along with a list of those that are not its citizens. Undocumented aliens are known in all societies. Some of course, people go missing and people become sort of, start working clandestinely, and all of that happens. Then there's an amnesty. Then in countries in the global north, this is the typical process, right? So you have an amnesty and people become. So sorry, but you were saying.
Will we actually end up in a position where we might actually concede to the idea of a list of residents, is what the original question was.
If it's doable, if it is even doable. I'm not even sure it's doable.
Exactly.
So I mean, look at the National Population Register, which was supposed to have been done with the census, and that's a very flawed instrument as well. It's basically saying that everyone who has lived in a place for 6 months and has expectations of living in that same place for another 6 months can come and say that they are. But then anyone else who is not a doubtful citizen can say that this person is a doubtful citizen. Now, this whole business of doubtful citizens again has been tested in Assam, and we have seen what complications it has caused. The injustice of proper citizens simply because they are poor and undocumented, and especially this applies especially to women. As you probably know, women have had the most difficult time in convincing foreigners' tribunals of their claims to citizenship, because being often unschooled and unlettered, not having documents like land, because women don't own land, not having, we know what a small percentage of Indians is actually registered at birth. Birth registration is a relatively recent phenomenon. So no birth certificates, no land certificates, no marriage certificates, because marriages have been solemnized in terms of religious ceremonies and so on. And they don't, even those who've been to school find it hard to persuade the foreigners' tribunals that this is a legitimate document that was given by the school. Questions, the kinds of questions that women have been asked by foreigners' tribunals are the following. How did this person who runs this school give you this certificate? They were not there at the time that you say you were there. This kind of thing. So Or yes, all of these documents pertaining to your legacy are fine, but how do we know that you are your mother's daughter or you are your father's daughter, more likely? So, you know, all these sorts of questions have arisen, and people who do not have documents, which a large number of poor people do not have proper documents, documents that will satisfy things like foreigners' tribunals. I mean, I don't know whether this process would just simply lead us to making more and more people stateless within our own borders. First thing they get deprived of is the right to vote, fine. Then they get deprived of the right to welfare. They have no rights at all. They can keep fighting their case up the court. They don't have the money to do it. It's public interest lawyers who do it for them. And then they'll end up in detention centers, and we are building and expanding our detention centers to put people who could well be citizens. It is not established beyond doubt that they are non-citizens or that they are illegal migrants. Putting them in detention centers and you know, leave them there. I just don't understand the rationale for this in a society which is poorly documented, where registration at birth has, you know, is a relatively recent and still not universal phenomenon. I do not understand how it is physically possible.
No, even
to
the
do
United
this.
States has not been able to.
It's not nobody.
No.
And states typically don't do this. They don't set out to collate a list of all their citizens, and especially a country as large as this, with a population as large as this. It seems. I mean, surely we have better things to do with our resources, our state capacity being what it is. Yeah.
So, is it India specific, these problems that we are discussing, or is it a fundamental conflict with of the rationale of nation states with the natural instinct of human beings to move? The idea of migration, as you earlier said, migration and people moving, these are millennia old. People move from one place to the other. Borders, even in this context, when you mentioned people on the western border, they were not even realizing that partition happened.
They were not aware.
Because how would they be? So, is that a more abstract fundamental problem of nation state itself, or is it because of politics that we are in?
Both, actually. It is a fundamental problem of the idea of the nation state. And we've seen, I mean, okay, so let's just look at the first half of the 20th century and the period between the world wars. The amount of statelessness that was created then, simply by the redrawing of borders in Europe. We're not even talking of an India-specific phenomenon. This is the context in which Hannah Arendt wrote about statelessness and the fact that the Jewish people and minorities in these various, you know, reorganized national boundaries and nation states, you know, did not have a home anymore, did not have a state to which they could appeal for their rights, and that made them rightless. These were people who became rightless because they were stateless. They did not have legal status. That's why they could not appeal for rights, because there was no agency or organization, no nation state to which they could. So the conundrum is precisely this, that it is for the enforcement of rights we look to the nation state. Without membership of a nation state, we become people without legal status, and then we become people, naturally, without rights. What Hitler did was instructive. Now, the Nazis stripped Jews who were in camps, they stripped them of citizenship first, and then did what they did to them. So they stripped them of citizenship because till so long as they were citizens, they could not do to them the terrible things that were done. So statelessness and rightlessness go together. Arendt called citizenship the right to have rights. You can't even have, you know, the right to have rights only
begins
comes
with
membership of a political community, legal membership. So legal status is very, very important. There are 10 million stateless people in the world today. There are some 38 million refugees in the world today. Yeah, there are 5 million asylum seekers. These are all UN figures. These are the millions of people who are without any legal standing. And then there are, over and above these, so many other kinds of what is now called in my line of work, precarious citizens.
Right.
Precarious citizens, or people in Assam, people with lapsed citizenship. They were citizens and they are no longer citizens. Or the assumption was they were citizens, and now the assumption is that they are not citizens. But we are dealing in a realm of assumptions where we cannot definitively establish anything. you know.
The concept
Yeah.
that you are not a citizen unless you prove it.
Unless you prove it.
So that is actually makes you practically everybody in a very precarious
That's right.
situation. Even if, I mean, the court ruling is that even if I hold an Indian passport, that is not proof
That
enough.
is not good enough. That is not enough. Yeah, that could have been acquired under all kinds of, you know, with using all kinds of
Again,
methods.
what you said,
Yeah.
the network of
Yeah.
influence and
Yeah,
documentation.
what Kamal Sadiq,
Yeah.
young colleague who works on citizenship, has called it networks of complicity and networks of kinship. Kinship is the other thing. On all sides of, on both the western and the eastern border of India, there are people who have always traveled across the border to meet family, for marriages, for funerals, and for things like this. I've met people like this on the western border, and I know and I've read about people on the eastern border similarly situated. So the border is, you know, to that extent, it is there, sometimes fenced, sometimes not fenced, sometimes protected and policed, and sometimes not. But people have been traversing these borders for decades. Simply because of
Oblivious of the
kinship,
fact that
no, and kinship relations.
Exactly, yeah.
And nobody's policing it, so you could do that. Now, of course, it's increasingly getting fenced, so presumably that will be harder. But so borders, how borders are experienced by people is very different from how borders are seen by states. Borders are experienced by people as probably as things that get in the way of their meeting their families. You know, their extended families, but or the desire to be with someone who is sick or dying or something like that, and a border can make that difficult, even though historically those families have lived in villages on either side of that border for centuries.
That point again, we're going just back to the fundamental conflict with the idea of nation state itself. At that point about communities, how people perceive communities. I am a member of India as a civic nation, but my more intimate connections are with my community, which is immediately there. So there again, we see the idea of nation state coming in conflict with the idea of people might perceive as community.
I think conflict would be a strong term. I think the founders of the republic saw it in exactly the way you said, civic nationalism, in a civic nationalist mode. They saw this as a large country, which it is, as a country with enormous diversity, which it is, and with different types of diversity for which you needed different types of measures to accommodate and manage that diversity. So federalism and linguistic states was, you know, one kind of management of diversity. Special cultural rights for religious minorities in the Constitution, in the Fundamental Rights chapter, were another way of managing diversity, cultural diversity, and so on. Now, I think the idea was that over time, definitely Nehru's idea and Ambedkar's idea, that over time, though Nehru probably did not see the difficulties and the challenges as clearly as Ambedkar did, but the idea was that over time we would become a more modern and secular polity, and these identities, which we are presumed to hold as our primary identities, cultural identities of various kinds, whether it's caste, religion, or whatever, language, whatever, would be confined to the private sphere, and in the public sphere we would be able to meet as citizens, as citizens without our identities. And that has been the assumption of liberal political theory as well.
But the trajectory has been the opposite.
But the trajectory, well, you know, but as many people have pointed out, I mean, even with excellent progressive ideas like social justice and democracy, the way in which we've translated them and made them our own can sometimes throw up problems. So social justice, which is a wonderful ideal, has led to a certain kind of politics, and mobilization of castes for political purposes was also important because it brought the backward castes into the polity, into the mainstream, and increased representation for the backward castes in parliament, for instance, which was, you know, languishing at, it was at 5% in 1952, but by the 1990s it had become 25%, or 1990s, I think, yeah. It had become 25%. So you needed that kind of mobilization. But in the process, as political scientists at the time pointed out, what you did was caste became more politically salient
Then
even
it
if
was
it became less socially salient. So it became less salient socially and more salient politically. Similarly with democracy, the idea, the simple principle of majority rule, which is really a very uh, a completely unsatisfactory definition of democracy. There's much more to democracy than the principle of majority rule. Majority rule is just the mechanism for creating governments, right? That principle of majority rule led to the idea that we are living with currently, the idea of majoritarianism, and that majoritarianism as Hindu majoritarianism, and the idea that in a democracy it is legitimate for majorities to rule in perpetuity, and it's fine if those majorities are religious majorities or whatever other kind of ascriptive majority. But that's not the point of democracy. In democracy, the whole principle of majority rule is supposed to be fluid and flexible,
Right.
in the sense that you don't have fixed majorities and fixed minorities. On different issues, we find ourselves in a majority. On other issues, we find ourselves in a minority.
So
That's not how it's working here.
Since you use the word fluidity again, so what we are actually confronted with is a state that has enhanced its capacity to be more powerful is trying to reduce the fluidity and make rigid, whether it is a border, the social borders, or the physical borders of the country by fencing, and also the tool of technology as an instrument which enables you to overcome a lot of the problems that you mentioned earlier about administrating the governmentality functions, because Aadhaar card is just the beginning. So how do you see that coming? The state has now theoretically the capacity to infinitely expand its power because of technology. If there is a problem today identifying who was born here, I think in the next decade or so, you can be genetically tagged. Aadhaar card can be just the beginning. So you do see history, the trajectory of history is that the state power expanding, and now we are at a point where technology is giving state that tool to go berserk.
Go berserk is a very frightening term, but no, I think you're right. The interesting thing is that there is a trajectory. I mean, the trajectory has been over the last, let's say, 40 years or so, the 30, 35 years at least, in the wake of globalization, states, and that was partly the outcome of the Washington Consensus, states were sold the idea that they should be doing less, right? Not just in the global north, but also in the global south. And states bought into that. They began to do less. They began to farm out their responsibilities, to contract out their responsibilities under this thing called new public management and so on. And so states were supposed to become facilitators rather than doers themselves in terms of whether it was development or whether it was welfare in the global north. That was the way the state began to be envisaged, right? So that was greatly to the liking of neoliberalism and those who championed neoliberal ideas, because they wanted a weaker state, or preferably a state which did nothing more than provide law and order, but certainly not provide welfare for different reasons, obviously, taxation and so on. So the idea that the state should be put in its place, the state should retreat, as the term was then, did not take into account, at least not to the extent that we know, the fact that not just technology, but even other kinds of security-related expenditures that the state was undertaking and that were adding to state power was actually ongoing. Even at the height of neoliberalism, states were accumulating more and more powers in terms of security expenditure. And now, of course, there's technology, there's surveillance, there's a great deal else that's made possible, and states are becoming more stronger. We have another problem here, which is of state coercion, of the use of law in creative and imaginative ways that actually diminishes, if not snatches away, even the civil and political liberties of citizens, right? So, on all of these counts, there is reason to fear excessive state power. But I think the question of how much power the state should have, and the question aligned with that of what is it that we expect states to do for their citizens, that is a timeless question. You know, you could answer it in the way the Scandinavians answered it in the middle of the 20th century, which is to raise taxes and to provide an architecture of social welfare that was the envy of the world. No longer, but that it was. So the point is, if you want states to do those things, particularly in developing societies in the global south, you know, whether it's South Africa or Brazil or India, we've all had our brushes with trying to make social rights more real. Not consistently, and not always successfully, but we have had that. The point is, do we want states to do that? And if states are to do that, then how much are we willing to allow states to invade our privacy through technology, through surveillance, and so on?
The argument is that
the state function,
yeah.
What is the functions that we want the state to perform, and what are the instruments we are willing to allow it to use in order for the performance of those functions? I think these are two related questions.
Right. All right. Okay. So we will. You referred to the idea of group rights. How caste gained a new salience in the democratic context. So I remember. I think to the effect that Hannah Arendt saying that if you are discriminated against on the basis of your group identity, the only way you can resist is as part of the group. Something to this effect. Now, you have written about the paradox of the pursuit of substantive citizenship right actually comes from being marked out as a separate group from the generic category of citizenship. Can you explain what do you mean by marked and unmarked citizens?
Right. Okay. So citizenship, at least civil and political citizenship, in a legal sense, everyone is equal. Whoever is a citizen is equal. Everyone is the same, and in the eyes of the state, the same, right? Now, the fact remains that in terms of our, and so if I may go back for a second to Dr. Ambedkar and then come back, as Dr. Ambedkar said at the close of the Constituent Assembly in that last speech, in that very famous speech, he said, in political life we are entering a time of contradictions. In political life, we have the principle of one person, one vote, one value, and we are entering this era of equality. But in terms of our social and economic life, this is a time we have to confront deep and profound inequalities. And if we don't confront those inequalities, then the structure of political democracy that the Constituent Assembly has built up can be blown to pieces. Okay? This was the warning. And it's not very different from what theorists of citizenship have been saying in the same period, in the 1950s, have been saying about citizenship. Let me, as a diversion, there was a French writer called Anatole France in mid-19th century France who said the law in its, something to the effect that, the law in its majestic equality forbids the rich and the poor alike to sleep under bridges, to beg in the street, to steal bread. Okay? It forbids the rich and the poor. But the point is, the rich don't need to sleep under bridges or beg in the street or steal bread. It is the poor who need to do that. So the conditions of a fuller citizenship only come when we recognize that, and this is well known, the conditions of the fullest enjoyment of citizenship require certain basic needs at least to be met. If those basic needs are to be met, state has to provide. And if the state has to provide, let's say, basic education, basic healthcare, food, housing, whatever else it might be, employment, etc., then one has to accept that, or then the experience of states is that people who need those, need that form of redress to make their political equality more equal, right, and their citizenship more equal, they need those special provisions from the state. And those special provisions depend upon their being marked out in particular ways. whether it's below poverty line, or used to be Antyodaya, or whether it is scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, you put in a box and labeled. Those boxes with labels they give you access to certain welfare provisioning, they give you access maybe to reservation, but what they also do is they stigmatize your citizenship. You are a marked citizen. Uh, and we all know that even as far as welfare is concerned, even where, or, no, let me put it this way, poor people generally get poor services, right? And the stigmatization of the poor, the stigmatization of people who are disadvantaged takes place alongside even the most noble state attempts, and I'm not saying state attempts are typically noble, they're not, but even the most noble attempt by any state, a fictitious hypothetical state, which seeks to do something for its poorer or disadvantaged, in different ways, disadvantaged citizens, will need to identify them, will need to, not geotag, but certainly to put them into boxes for purposes of redressal. And that process itself, while on the one hand it seems to make them more equal to the proper citizen, the unmarked citizen, also stigmatizes and therefore makes them marked citizens. That's basically, it's a very sort of simple idea.
Right. So the development backwardness argument is pretty clean, and there can be much debate about it. But the question of representation, because particularly in the context of this creamy layer argument, many of the people who actually represent those communities argue that excluding the creamy layer from that particular group from the benefit of that special mark out actually defeats the purpose of it. Why? Because they are the most capable people to represent that community. Would you?
That is a
stretch, you think?
It's a bit of a stretch, I think. I mean, there, among other proposals that have come has been the idea that you could do 2 generations or 3 generations of a particular section, but try and diffuse the benefits of these to more people. But the point is, what even are the benefits of reservation today? Maybe in educational institutions, public universities. What is the status of public universities? What is the quality of public universities today? Are we bringing in people on reserved, under these quotas? But what kind of education are we providing? That's an important question, right? Are we really empowering and enabling them through the system we have? And as far as employment is concerned, government employment has been shrinking over the years. So, how much can reservations actually achieve with the shrinkage in the overall amount of government employment that there is? So, which is why many Dalit intellectuals have been arguing that education in English, to strengthen that, to as it were make loans available to enable Dalit people to enter the market, to be able to set up enterprises, and the Dalit chambers of commerce and industry and so on, their agenda. That also makes sense, because the sphere of government employment has severely shrunk.
A couple of more questions before you conclude. One is, if you are to make a forceful argument in favor of civic nationalism, which is as distant as possible from our ascribed identities, as Nehru would have liked, are we ending up in a position where we are arguing for more homogenization of a nationwide homogenization of social attitude and eligibility, and
that certainly is the mood of the day. Homogenization is the mood of the day. One nation, one election, one everything else. But I don't think that civic nationalism, the best form of civic nationalism, if there is such a form, it may be utopian. I don't think that civic nationalism should lead to the obliteration of difference. Cultural differences are something that the world valued till a few years ago. Why is it that we do no longer value cultural diversity? We should be able to value cultural diversity. We have, in this country particularly, a richness of cultures that we have for decades enjoyed. We enjoyed the diversity of and partaking of each other's cultures, and there's no reason why we should not continue to do the same, simply because there is a hegemonic ideological diktat that we should all think the same way and behave the same way and wear the same clothes and eat the same food and and so forth, and marry approved people, etc. So I don't see that the argument of civic nationalism per se leads to or necessitates or entails the obliteration of difference. It does not. It is possible for difference to flourish and thrive even within a civic nationalist framework. I don't see where the conflict is coming from. Right now the threat is from a hegemonic ideological framework.
Okay, in our final segment we'll talk a little bit about migration. So we started this conversation about the difficulties that India as a country, generally modern nation states have to face, which is defining the territory and determining who are the people. The kind of migration, both forced and voluntary in the recent decades has sort of derailed this whole idea because of diaspora populations around the world. Many countries now have dual citizenship. You can have 2 passports, 3 passports, some countries. Now our own Prime Minister said it is not the color of your passport but the linkage of our blood that decides your citizenship of being Indian, the cultural nationalism that you've spoken about in your book. How does that work? Even within the country also, we've seen, you've written about it, when the people are moving, the migrants who had to walk during COVID, they were lesser citizens. So how does migrant sit in the overall scheme of idea of citizenship and development? Because a lot of people who are workers, who are taxpayers, are not citizens.
Yeah, absolutely. Should I address the diaspora first and then this?
Whichever way,
okay.
yes.
So yeah, okay. So as far as the diaspora is concerned, I was astonished to discover just a few days ago that India has the largest diaspora of any country in the world. Okay, and the Indian diaspora is spread across 208 countries. That's a lot of. Okay, now. The diaspora is very articulate, very vocal. It probably certainly contributes to campaign funding for the BJP particularly. The overseas friends of the BJP do that systematically. It also does campaigning, including phone campaigning and so on from countries in the global north. They do all of that, but they don't actually influence electoral outcomes. They're good to fill stadiums when prime ministers go abroad and so on, but they don't actually. Because they can't vote, they don't have the vote. Even NRIs, who are not citizens of another country, even they have to come here to vote. They can't vote. They can't do distance voting. So we shouldn't overstate the influence of the diaspora when it comes to. What we should, however, mark is the fact that I know there are some 4 or 5 million OCI holders, but the fact that as many as 100 OCI holders had their OCI cards cancelled in the last 8-9 years is cause for alarm, only because they were critical of the regime in India. Just for a tweet or for a critique of Hindu nationalism or whatever, they have lost their OCI cards. So that is one thing to think about. On the question of migrant workers, yes, at the time of COVID, of course, when workers migrate, we have even the ration requirement is connected to the family. I mean, the ration subsidy goes to a family and not to an individual. So when the worker migrates, if it's a man, he does not have access to the public distribution system. The family back at home would have access to the public distribution system. Even if he is a single person, he would need to be re-registered for public distribution system in the city where he's working. But these are what kinds of workers? Mostly migrant workers are people who work in very insecure sort of informal contexts like construction work, right? Sometimes on appearing daily at the labor chalk to be picked up for the day, not even a monthly wage, but a daily wage, if that.
So, just a small interruption. Even when you are a white collar worker, you can be a CEO in Dubai,
right.
Still you are not a citizen. You cannot vote.
Yeah.
But
most many people of that kind don't care to vote, by the way.
Yep.
Those kinds of people can purchase citizenship today. You have golden visas and you have golden passports.
Right.
There's a flourishing industry in Europe, which Europe as a whole is worried about, the European Parliament is worried about, But the fact is that, by buying citizenship in countries like Cyprus and Malta and so on, you have a gateway into Europe, and that route is being used by a lot of people.
Even the US citizenship you can actually buy with an
Yeah,
investment.
you can with a certain amount of investment,
yeah.
you can. So the fact is that that industry is thriving. If you look at the, in many of these sort of Western publications, they have these companies which are constantly advertising routes to citizenship and paths to citizenship.
So at that point, would you say we've been talking about, now we are entering into a very interesting territory. So we've been talking about threat to civic territorial nationalism from cultural nationalism so far. Now we're talking about threat to that from a globalized capitalism, which neither respects the culture nor territory.
Yes, it doesn't, and it's a self-serving thing. It's individualism sort of multiplied a million times. It is a person looking out for their own bank balance and their own lifestyle. They are not interested in voting anywhere. They don't care if
And
they
the
don't
states
vote.
that are willing to accommodate their interest.
Yes, and the states that do, they actually disadvantage their own, and this is a point that comes up frequently. Their own citizens do not like this because they are invested. So citizens who do jury duty, for instance, in certain countries, don't like the fact that other people come, buy citizenship, don't perform any of the duties of citizenship. They're not invested in the political community that is that country. They do not want to partake of it. And those who have 3 passports, which also there is a population of such people who have 2 or 3 passports, they don't actually stay anywhere long enough for tax reasons, and others don't stay anywhere long enough to be connected to, let alone invested culturally or emotionally invested in the polity in which they have taken membership. For them, it's just a question of tax and investment conditions. So even people who belong to let's say a country like Vietnam, I've read this somewhere, become foreign nationals, and then they get better terms of investment and tax waivers in the country from which they came. So they go back as foreigners and foreign nationals to avail of those facilities. So there are, so the idea of citizenship as a sense of belonging to a political community, as what you owe your fellow citizens, a sense of reciprocity, a sense of solidarity with fellow citizens, that emotional sense of citizenship is withering away under these current circumstances. At least for a very small, minuscule section of people it is.
All right, okay, in conclusion, so let me ask actually the 2 parts to the question. One is, how do you see the prospects of civic nationalism in India, number 1. Number 2, this last mention of in the current century, will you see the idea of membership of any community itself becoming completely meaningless for the richer, powerful people who are mobile at an unprecedented scale and level?
To the latter question, absolutely, we are seeing it happening right now. So there's no question. On the first part of your question, it depends on where you look. So if you look at the ambient political discourse, which is dominated by the ruling dispensation, then you get the sense that civic nationalism has to be aligned. If at all it is civic, it has to be aligned to cultural nationalism. It has to be aligned to the idea of majoritarian Hindu Rashtra, and that's the only kind of nationalism that is going to be permitted. Whether it's civic or not is another matter, right? It's probably not, so, or definitely not. Civic in the sense in which we understand it. But if you look at other studies and surveys, of course these are small numbers of people, but if you look at, for instance, the Lokniti survey not long ago said that that a substantial proportion of people who were surveyed, I think 60-70%, I don't remember the number now, you reported it, believe that India is a plural country and that there is scope for religious diversity in India, and everyone has should be part of and seen as part of this political community. So I guess the answer to that question will really come after June the 4th.
Thank you, Professor Jayal, and thank you very much for joining this episode of Terms of Engagement. On that optimistic note, we conclude. We will see how things go.
Thank you.
Thank you.